Hello and welcome. Welcome to our talk this evening, The Process of Addiction, with our facilitator, Renee Dangerfield-Allen. We're so happy that you could join us this evening. My name is Nicole Imgrund, and I'm the owner of River's Edge Counseling Center. And this talk tonight is part of a series of talks, our Wellness Matters talks. We have about 60 or so of these talks that are already recorded on our website on the blog page. So you're welcome to take a look at past talks that we have hosted. And also we still have a number of talks to look forward to this spring, and you're welcome to attend any of them. Coming up, we have body positivity or body neutrality, fostering self-compassion, self-care for care partners, taking care of your own needs while you care for another, and know thyself, personality and happiness. So lots of variety coming up, and you can register for all of those on our website. I would like to just introduce our speaker for this evening, Renee. Renee has been in the field of mental health for 20 years now, and she actually started as an addictions counselor, but she's been in private practice since 2019, and we're really fortunate to have Renee as part of our team at River's Edge, where she sees adults and couples for therapy. A little bit about Renee's practice. The psychodynamic approach particularly resonates for Renee because it is insight-oriented, which helps her clients to understand the why or the roots of their situation, and also because it places value on the therapeutic relationship. But beyond the why, many are also seeking answers to their how questions. How do I change myself, this behavior, or this relationship? And to further support this discovery, Renee draws on tenets of a whole host of different kinds of therapies: trauma theory, resilience and attachment theory, Gottman, emotional focus therapy, motivational interviewing, and many others, and maybe notably also expressive arts. She has training in that area as well. And utilizing, a whole variety of these techniques, Renee works from a person-centered approach, which means that she works together with clients to determine what the best therapeutic approach is for them, and always valuing and prioritizing safety, trust, choice, and empowerment in her work. Also joining us today is Sabrina Roach, one of our practicum students, who is going to be supporting Renee in her presentation. It's a surprise to me as well to know how that is going to all come together. I'm really excited for the presentation tonight, though. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Renee to screen share. And while you're doing that, I'll just let people know that the chat and the Q&A functions are open. All of your cameras and microphones are off, but I'll be kind of monitoring the chat as we go in case there's any technical things. And then Renee's presentation won't fill the whole hour, so there'll be a little bit of time at the end. If you have comments you'd like us to share with the group or questions for Renee, just put them in the chat and we'll take a look at them at the end of her presentation. Yeah. So Renee, it looks a little different than when we looked at it. We've got a bit of a gray kind of window covering your presentation. I wonder if, oh, there we go. I don't know what it was, but it all looks great now. Good. Okay.
I toggle back here, is it gray again?
It is. So
Okay.
you know what that's about. Yeah. Is that your other window?
It is.
So you want to separate them out a bit, maybe.
I'm not sure why that's happening now. Okay. Okay. And is that still happening, Nicole?
No, oh, yes.
Okay.
Didn't
Okay.
have to practice.
I'm not sure what to do because that's Okay.
Are the windows overlapping at all?
They are overlapping, yeah. They were before though too. So I'm
Yeah.
there. I've switched it so they're not overlapping. So that has that kind of corrected the problem.
That looks good. Yeah,
Okay.
I think we're there. Yeah. Okay. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Nicole and Sabrina, for participating tonight with me. And I'm not sure how many of you are here watching. I can't see you, but I'm trusting that there's some folks there. And I'm just, yeah, I'm really excited to present this information tonight. And I would imagine there's just a whole host of reasons why you've decided to log in for this webinar. Maybe you're wondering for yourself, or maybe you're thinking about a family member, or a friend, or a coworker. So there could just be so many reasons. I hope that this information is valuable for you and that you learn something. And like Nicole said, we'll have some time for questions at the end. And so I'll just ask that you kind of hold those questions until then, unless it's a technological issue, and Nicole will be troubleshooting that. And we're just going to jump in and get started. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is the process of addiction. But before we get there, we're going to look a little bit about culture and the impact that culture can have on how we think about addiction and that process, and maybe how we also perceive people who might be struggling with that. I'm using the word addiction, which isn't as popular now. It's commonly referred to as substance misuse. And I'm choosing to use addiction tonight because I also want to think about process addiction. So sometimes folks aren't ingesting a substance, but there's a behavior that can become addictive. So that's why I'm using that word tonight. We're also going to talk about a bit about sort of the how. So what are those stages, the why, and I'm going to explain something called habituation and extinction to you, and then we'll go over some resources that'll be listed at the end, and then a question and answer period. And again, thank you to Sabrina. She's going to help out with the stages of addiction piece of the presentation. So if we think about culture can mean so many different things, right? We're all influenced by our culture. So where you grow up or who you grow up with, all of our caregivers, our school, our neighborhood, your city, your province, your country. Not everybody watching is probably from Canada, right? So we all have different things that influence how we think about things and shape us. And we're also individuals. So just because we might be in the same neighborhood or even home doesn't mean that we're the same. But for the sake of tonight, I used to do this workshop at a treatment center and did it in a kind of a question and answer sort of a format. And that worked really well. And clients said they just really appreciated it. And so that's why I've asked Sabrina to join us tonight, so that we can kind of do a bit of that question and response piece. So Sabrina's going to represent all of you. So I appreciate that she's one person with one voice and perspective, but it can just sort of mix it up a little bit to have somebody else giving some input rather than just me giving information. So the first question, how does culture influence the way we think about substance misuse? So I've just given you a whole bunch of ideas and information about what might influence how we think about that, right? I remember when I lived in England for a time, pub culture is very, very big there. And whole families would go on a Sunday and have a really big feast, like a roast and Yorkshire pudding on Sundays. And it was just very common every day for people to go and have a pint or a few pints of beer. And it reminded me a lot of Starbucks or coffee culture or Tim Hortons here in Canada. And so just that difference is one example. And I really liked this quote, so I put it in here. Culture can be defined as all the ways of life, including arts, beliefs, and institutions of a population that are passed down from generation to generation. Culture has been called the way of life for an entire society. As such, it includes codes of manners, dress, language, religion, rituals, and art. So it is so many things. And it's so important, I think, to begin there, because we're all going to have different perspectives and opinions, right? So if we look at the process of addiction on a continuum, there are 6 stages in the model that I'm going to go through with you tonight. If you just Google the process of addiction, you're going to see many different models, and some have 2, some have 3 or 4 or 5, even 8 stages. So I am going with the one that I used to use when I worked at Alberta Health Services at the treatment center. And that's what we taught there. And then also some learning from Dr. Timothy Gallese, who as a retired addiction psychiatrist now, but he used to do staff in services for us. And so I learned a great deal from Dr. Gallese as well. So that's the information that kind of informs this presentation. So the first stage is called non-use. And so this is where I'm going to invite Sabrina, if you want to come in and help me with some of these questions. So when you think about what does non-use mean, what comes to mind for you?
Just, I mean, abstinence, I suppose. So not using, not drinking, not using any type of substances such as drugs or possibly cigarettes, and even
Okay.
in some religions, caffeine.
Yeah, okay, that is true. Does it matter why they're not using?
I don't think it. I don't think it matters. To everybody, it's different. They have
Okay,
different reasons, I think.
okay. And would age factor in at all to that sort of label of non-use?
It could, yes. Yeah, definitely. Like underage.
Yeah, okay. It's and those are really common answers that I used to hear when I was doing this workshop. And for some folks, they thought, well, yeah, age does matter if they're underage, and for others, it doesn't. So if we're going to compare that and contrast it with the research, what the addictions research says is that a non-user is just simply defined as someone who has never used. And it doesn't matter why they haven't used, they just never have. It also has nothing to do with age. And so it's not about morality or anything like that, or previous problems. Okay, and so if we look then and go into stage 2, this is called experimenting. So what comes to mind, Sabrina, when you think about experimental use? What would that mean?
To me, that means maybe an adolescent that's trying something for the first time due to peer pressure, such as drinking or smoking.
Okay. Is it specific to a certain substance or behavior if someone's experimenting? Does it matter what it is?
I don't think so.
Okay. I didn't say this at the beginning. I should explain that I have not given Sabrina the questions ahead of time, so she didn't know at all what she was in for. And I did that intentionally so that she didn't have all the so-called right answers. And so she's just sort of learning this presentation as we go along with all of you. So, okay. And again, do you think age kind of factors in with this one at all?
When I first think of it, I automatically think of adolescence, but obviously it doesn't. I don't think it matters. Anytime you can experiment.
Okay. Yeah, I think especially in I just think about, I grew up in Alberta as well, and I think that adolescence is a really common time for people to have their first experiences of using substances. Whereas, of course, in some cultures, though, it just would never happen in adolescence. It might not be until adulthood. So it does depend, but that's certainly a common way of how we're thinking about it sort of more locally. So for the research perspective, it's really experimentation begins the very first time you use a substance or engage in that behavior. exactly what you said at the beginning, Sabrina. And and once you begin, though, you don't ever return to the non-user stage, which is interesting because sometimes folks will think, well, if I stop using, then I'm a non-user. We commonly kind of refer to it that way. But in terms of the addictions research, you don't go back to being a non-user. But so as far as experimenting goes, it's just once you start, that's when you become experimenting at whatever age and for whatever substance or the potentially addictive behavior. So if we go into stage 3, this one is called social use. And I always find this conversation very, very interesting because it's a term that we do commonly use, right? So what comes to mind when you think of social use, Sabrina?
I think of using a substance when you're around other people, to just kind of share in that use, I suppose.
Okay. Does how much or how often factor into that?
That's kind of tricky, but I mean, there might be people that are social once in a while and others that are social all the time.
Mm-hmm. It does get tricky, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So do we always have to be with other people for it to count as social use?
I would say yes.
Okay, thank you. And I think the answers that you gave is what I heard most commonly when I was doing this with a big group as well. So I would imagine that lots of the folks that are watching right now would probably agree with that or think something similar. So then if we contrast that with what the research says, social use really just means that there is no recognizable pattern. And it's not about socializing. And it's totally random, right? So the key point with this is that it's random. So if I know that, let's say I'm on a baseball team in the summer and we have games on Friday night, and after the game, we all go for a beer somewhere, that's not random. It's a pattern because it is a recognizable pattern. The fact that we're calling it a pattern, though, doesn't mean that means problem. Lots of people go and do that and they don't have substance misuse issues, right? So just in terms of the theory, though, it's to be in this stage, there isn't any kind of pattern. So then if we're going to go to stage 4, this next one is called habitual. So what comes to mind when you think about habitual use, Sabrina?
Well, I'm just going to say that it has a pattern to it.
Yeah. Would you, if before that other slide, though, is that how you would have thought of it?
No, I would have said, well, maybe like
Mhm.
every weekend, for example. It does have a pattern, but it
Yeah.
would be something that you've created a habit of using on certain times.
Okay. And I think this question, it maybe sort of feels redundant, but if you think about that word habit, when you're considering addiction or misuse, does it seem different, I guess, the word habit than maybe the word problem?
Well, if you give the example of having a beer on Friday nights with the team, I wouldn't say that would be misuse.
Mhm.
I would have called that social before this presentation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think habit versus misuse, I think there is a bit of a difference there still.
Yeah. In this one, I think it gets it gets more gray and difficult to define. And I found in the workshop too, there was more variety in the responses that I would hear from people. So we really understand it differently. And thinking about just going back to social use, one of the things I used to sometimes ask too was, well, if I socialize every single day of the week, and in fact, I socialize for lunch and dinner and at night as well, is it still social use if it's involving something, right? And that's where, if we go to the next step of habitual, this one can feel sort of tricky as well, because maybe my habits seem okay to me and they seem okay to all the people in my life. But maybe for some people looking at it, they sort of have some concern about it, right? So we don't always agree on it. So if we go to the research says there is a recognizable pattern. So yeah, you get the prize for that one, Sabrina. And as I've said, the pattern does not necessarily mean that somebody has an addiction or that it's that it is a problem use, but it might mean that there are some beginnings of problems. So you can all probably predict what the next one is called. Problem use. So what comes to mind when you think about problem use?
That your substance use has kind of taken a big part of your life. You either use every day or every second day or multiple times a day. It's just become a problem, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. So what determines problem though, or like, how would you define that? You've already given some examples of it. You talked about frequency,
Mhm.
but what if I'm okay with my frequency?
I think if it starts affecting your ability to function in everyday
Ah,
life, affecting your finances or
mhm.
your friendships, work.
Okay. And you'd led us beautifully into the next one. And I'm not going to ask this question of you. We'll go to the other slide. So I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but it's really just thinking about what areas of life begin to be affected by people. So when I was doing intakes for folks at the downtown treatment center or detox or at the treatment center, the residential one, we looked at 10 major life areas and would talk about it with folks and see, did they think that that area of their life was beginning to be affected in negative ways? And so the research says, like you said, problems begin to develop in major life areas over time with continued use. And we know that some folks who are engaging in behaviors or substances and misusing them begin to sort of do that with more frequency. Not everybody does, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. And so looking at 10 major life areas, it can be friendships can start to be affected, work might start to be affected, family, school, if you're at school. People sometimes start to have legal issues, financial issues, emotional and mental health issues. Their leisure activities might be kind of go by the wayside because they're spending more time with drug use. Sometimes people start to spend quite a bit of their life accessing drugs. For other folks, their leisure activities all might begin to center around their use of substances, or it could be whether it's gaming, or like I gave the example of beer after the games, or some people, their hobby becomes making beer or wine or things like that. Your physical health can begin to be affected. And it might not be that you have a physiological dependency, but you might be starting to have negative effects in terms of hangovers and weight loss, things like that. Where people sometimes gain weight. And depending on the substances, it can just affect you all over physically. We know that women begin to have organ damage about 20 years ahead of men. And this is the average woman and average man. Of course, we all know probably exceptions to that rule, but so a female might be coming in at 40, already having some major health issues, heart disease, or things like that. Whereas a male, sometimes it will take longer. As I said, there are exceptions to that. And then an area that sometimes folks don't really consider is your spiritual life. And your spirituality can be something very different than religion. They don't have to have, they're not necessarily the same thing. For some folks, it's just about their sense of self or their soul. I sometimes call when people are getting into problem use and misuse, it can be like a soul wound. It gets hard to look in the mirror. And so self-esteem and things can begin to be affected. So we look at these areas, and it's interesting because sometimes somebody might come in for an assessment or an intake, but they don't want to be there. Their employer's forcing them to, or they've been given an ultimatum maybe by their spouse or their partner, and they may or may not have very much insight into how their substance use or the process addiction is affecting them. And then maybe, that person engages for a while, maybe they don't, or they might come back in 6 months or in a year or two and say, I can kind of see that maybe there's a couple of more areas of my life that are being affected now. I didn't really see it before. Or maybe they didn't really think it was anything to do with them. They thought their boss was unreasonable, and so was their spouse, and it was their fault, and they should just get off their back. And then sometimes a shift begins to happen where they start to realize, okay, maybe it isn't just my boss or my spouse and other people, external things. Maybe some of it is about that behavior. And when that shift happens, that sort of ownership, that can help folks to begin to change and make that shift. And for some people, that sort of, I guess, insight, we could call that, never comes. And for other people, they may know that they've had a problem for a very, very long time and they don't care because they like the positive things that come with substance use and some of those behavioral addictions, or maybe they do care and they're devastated, but they feel stuck and don't really know how to get out of that behavior. But what we do know is that problems lead to loss and more loss. We go into stage 6. This one is called abuse. Okay, so what comes to mind when you think of substance or process abuse, Sabrina?
Well, kind of the beginning of physical dependency. That's just kind of what comes to mind when your body actually needs it to.
Okay. Are there certain behaviors that you might think of that go along with abuse?
When people break their value system to get the substance, such as lying or stealing, not going to work, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the more areas that that's happening in, right, the more difficulty somebody might have. So I think at this point, I'm going to show a video. It's about 5 minutes long, but it's just such a powerful, excellent video to show at this stage of stage 6 of what we're talking about here. So I'm going to click on that and That's a really powerful depiction of what the process of using can look like. And there's like high reward for the brain initially, and then we keep chasing it. And over time, though, there's less reward and more consequences. In the video, the consequence for the bird was falling and injury, but the consequences can be just so many. So the research says in the stage of abuse, the losses lead to more loss, and it can be in so many different areas. So it can lead to isolation and loneliness, grief over the losses. It could be loss of friends, of family, a sense of purpose. I was talking about that sense of soul wound. So it can be hard to look in the mirror, right? And self-loathing can happen, lowered self-esteem. If you lose your employment, you may have unstable finances then, which can lead to unstable housing. Some people lose their home, can lose your partner, your spouse, and some of it too with more isolation and maybe loss of employment. Boredom can be a really big one for folks. For some people, it leads to legal problems. Maybe they get impaired charges or they get arrested. It can also lead to incarceration and chronic health problems. And those health problems can be emotional, spiritual, mental, or physical. And for some folks, it also can include death. Okay, at this point, I'm going to say thank you so much to Sabrina for answering my questions and for giving your input. I really appreciate it. I'm going to move on to sort of the last piece of the presentation, which is around some of the questions that people most commonly ask me. So I'm going to go through a few of those, and then I'll open it up to questions from those that are participating. So a frequent question is, why do some people end up with problems and others don't? Why does that process look different, right? We all know somebody who's maybe never had very many losses in their life despite some heavy substance use, but typically they're the exception to the rule. But the answer can be kind of found in the biopsychosocial spiritual model of addiction. And that's a big mouthful, so I'm going to explain what that is. You can think about the bio piece, that's your biology, so that's your genetics and the health of your body as well. So we can influence our genetics by our lifestyle. And the psychology is a combination of your genetics, but also your personality and the way that you are in the world, right? And the social piece is your environment. So we talked a bit about that with culture, but it's sort of the where you grew up. So, and with your caregivers, for some people that's in a home with their parents, for other people it might not be with their parents. So it's whoever was taking care of you as you were growing up that has an influence on you, in addition to your personality and your genetics. And then that final piece is the soul or the spirit, which I had explained just briefly. That's kind of your sense of self. And for some people, that spirituality is connected to some form of otherness or being or universal spirit. It can mean so many things to different people, but all of that contributes to our experience with substances and why some people may have an issue and some don't. You might have in a family two siblings that grow up in the same home with the same parents. One of them ends up with addiction and the other one doesn't. So, you know, we know that people can inherit a little bit of different genetics, but it can also be very much about the individual's personality. Maybe in their environment, they're treated a little bit differently by the caregivers. So it's complex to answer that question. We also know, though, that trauma has a big piece of that, and trauma can be very much connected to all of the biopsychosocial aspect. So Gabor Mate, who is a renowned physician in Canada, and he's written about addiction and trauma and many other subjects, but he said trauma is the incubator for substance misuse. And that seems to be the case. And most of the folks that I work with, they've experienced adverse experiences in their childhood, sometimes in adulthood, or both. And that does tend to influence people. We also know that folks with mental health issues are more at risk for substance misuse and vice versa. So they seem to be correlated. Another common question is, if I stop using for a period of time, can I go back to social use? This was a big one in the treatment center because people wanted to be able to go back to social use, right? The idea of abstaining for the rest of their lives is just completely overwhelming. And certainly within the, there's something called harm reduction, which would be to reduce harm. So the goal isn't to abstain from something completely, but to really go to reduce the amount of negative impact it's having in someone's life. And there are a lot of folks that find that they can do that and that harm reduction really helps them. So the answer for this presentation, though, that I want to give, I'm going to give you a little bit of jargon here. Because the response that I learned was actually from Dr. Galeese, who was the addiction psychiatrist with AHS that I was mentioning I worked with. And he explained two concepts with us to help us understand this. One is habituation, the other is extinction. And so I have a couple of definitions. I'm going to just go into my note here just so I can read it. So it's from Webster's Dictionary. It says habituation is tolerance to the effects of a drug acquired through continued use. So how this applies here is if we think about our brain, our brain is filled with neurochemicals, right? And it kind of each sort of person's body has its sort of equilibrium of the neurochemicals that are the balance for that person's body. When you use a substance or even certain behaviors, they give your brain kind of a hit of a certain neurochemical. For example, drinking alcohol gives your brain a boost of dopamine, right? Which can feel really good. That's what was sort of happening with that bird, right? But over time, our brain goes like, what's going on? Why is there all this extra dopamine, right? And so it needs to kind of accommodate or regulate itself with that extra amount of alcohol or whatever the substance is. Then over time, the brain kind of goes, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. And then it doesn't have the same big reaction. We saw that with the bird as well. And then eventually it doesn't really do anything. So it's like chasing the high, it's kind of commonly called. So the other piece or analogy that could be helpful is if you think about, let's say our brain is like a phone and apps. So substance use is like getting a new app. So let's say I get the alcohol app. At first, my brain has to learn how to cope with the alcohol. So the phone, for the alcohol app, it's got, you got to download it. It takes time. But then once the app is on your phone, it knows, it just does that, right? So that process for this conversation is the habituation piece. Your brain's learning how to recognize what's going on with the substance. And then the other piece is called extinction. I'm just going to get my definition here. Extinction in psychology is defined as the gradual weakening of a conditioned response resulting in a behavior stopping or going extinct over time. So let's say if the bird stops ingesting the bubble or egg yolk, it looks like to me, but the bubble, eventually it's going to pass by them and it's not going to have the same kind of craving, is sort of a simple way to say that. But what extinction isn't in the analogy of the phone app is, okay, so I stopped using my alcohol app, so the app just is gone off of my phone. So how that in this example would be, okay, well, if I stop drinking for 3 months, I'm not having all these problems anymore, I should be able to go back to it. So that kind of logic is sort of thinking, just because I'm not using my app on the phone, the app no longer exists on my phone, which isn't the case. What's more likely is you stop for a while, so your brain kind of gets used to the not getting that hit of dopamine from the alcohol. And then when you go back to it 3 months later, 6 years later, it doesn't matter. Your brain instantly recognizes it, runs the app and goes, oh yeah, I know this. And it reacts accordingly. Hoping that makes sense. So going back to this question, what happens is once this yellow line here is sort of to represent us crossing over a line. So we're social use, there's no patterns, then all of a sudden we go to habitual where there are patterns. And it seems to be that when we cross over that line, our brain has downloaded the app, it gets it. We don't actually ever get to delete the app, is the simplest way to put it. For some people, or Dr. Gillese had said, for most people, that line is in between social and habitual. For some folks, it might be back here between experimenting and social, or even right from the beginning, out of the gate, it's a problem and there's apparent addiction as soon as they begin experimenting. What's not as common, there are of course exceptions, but it's not very common that once you get into problem use and abuse, that you're going to ever go back to social use, right? Sometimes folks manage that. I haven't met many or heard of very many. Another common question is, okay, well, can I change what I use? Blank wasn't a problem before. So sticking with this example, okay, I'm not going to drink anymore because I recognize, that just gets me into a world of problems, but why can't I gamble sometimes? Or, I don't know, look at porn every day or whatever it is. Or other folks will say, yeah, I'm not going to use crack anymore. I get it, but I've never had a problem with alcohol. So why Why can't I drink alcohol? Again, some people can, and it doesn't seem to transfer over to other substances. Most people can't, and over time they find, you know what? I seem to, it just all is a problem now. I don't get it. And so to answer that, we've already kind of answered it. It's the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So some folks, there's other things at play that make it difficult for them. It might be that they have trauma, and that need to kind of be numb and self-medicate that trauma still exists. So if they've taken away their drug of choice, they might find other ones. For other folks, it's just simply about they've already habituated their brain to get used to substances that alter it. And so any other behavior or substance that's going to give the brain a hit could become problematic over time. It's complicated though, in terms of there are different variables, and so it's for a brief presentation, I can't go through all of the variables, but I get the sense you probably have some ideas about that. And then another common question, and the final question that I was going to present is, why can't I, or why can't they just stop, right? Why couldn't the bird, before it was in complete isolation and darkness and just stop? And that is also answered by what's come before in the presentation tonight. It depends on, is there a genetic predisposition toward addiction? Is it a personality thing? Often it's trauma. There's so much trauma and pain that the person isn't able to stop until they have the support to work through trauma, so that they're not in so much pain. They have tools to manage it so that as things come up or trauma is triggered, they can cope without needing to be numb as often. And so it's often a process of learning different behaviors before somebody can give that up consistently. And that is also why relapse can be quite common, right? In terms of resources, I've got a couple of slides here. We have so many resources in Alberta in terms of telephone resources. There are 24-hour helplines. This first one here, Addictions Alberta Quits, is for smoking. The others are more general. We have Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, which has great information, and addiction services in Edmonton, all kinds of supports. And then River's Edge Counseling in our services section on the webpage. And then if you go to addiction, has great resources and information and there as well. The Canadian Centre on Addiction also has good information about alcohol and the risk of using alcohol with cancer. Canadian government as well. And then there are 12-step programs, put a couple on here, and then Smart Recovery, which is a non-spiritual program. It's more cognitive behaviorally based. And yeah, this is my contact information as well as River's Edge. If you would like to see a therapist here, you can contact admin through this number or email, or you can ask any questions to me at this email address. And now I would like to invite you to, if you have any questions.
I just want to say first, Renee, that was excellent. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. Yeah. You've got the gray piece up. It doesn't matter so much now, but just so you know, if people are still trying to get information from that slide.
Should I go back?
We do have one question here. If someone, actually, before people log off too, before I read this question, it's okay if we put your slide presentation with the video on the webpage, and then people can see the resources.
Of course, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so just so people don't feel too anxious about getting it all down. The question is, if someone says, I can take it or leave it, is that social use?
That is a tricky question. It depends again about the pattern. So culturally, we would say, well, yeah, that probably is social use. If they don't seem to have a problem with taking, take it or leave it. But if there's a pattern in how they do use, then it could be that it's habitual. Again, it's not about at that point, is it a problem? And some people will say they can take it or leave it, but actually their behavior would sort of indicate otherwise.
That's a good point too. Mhm. Any other questions? Comments at all as we finish up this evening?
It's a quiet group. There are no bad questions or stupid questions. All questions probably other people want to. Oh, here's one.
Yeah, when someone in a certain setting struggles to abstain, is that considered addiction?
Not necessarily. I think that certain settings can be really uncomfortable for people. And so, like if you think about like social anxiety, like some people, they need a little bit just to be able to feel like they can even cope with the situation. But it doesn't necessarily mean they have an addiction. Over time, they could develop one. But there might be somebody, let's say, who has some trauma, and if they're in certain situations, it gets triggered, and then they're using substances or the behaviors because they're triggered about their trauma. Again, over time, that could become an addiction, but it doesn't necessarily mean it is one right away. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I see another question here. It says, if you learn to cope with the trauma, will the addiction disappear? So from the perspective of the research that I presented tonight, the answer would be no, because that would be like, if for the addiction to disappear, it would be like extinction, like the app's deleted off the phone, when really coping with the trauma might help the person have a more stable life so that they can manage to abstain and stop the behavior or the substance use. And they might be more stable in their recovery and not relapse as much if they've managed their trauma. I will say though too that sometimes people who have trauma are misusing substances and they might have problems, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've gone into like the abuse stage, and some people, like I was saying before, can seem to step back from problematic use to it isn't a problem anymore. Not everybody can, but some can.
Thanks. Any other questions or comments? Looks like that might wrap it up for the evening. Yeah. Thanks, Renee. Thanks, Sabrina, for being willing to do that. There's a bit of vulnerability answering questions that you haven't had in advance, be part of a webinar. So, but that added a lot. That felt like it was a little bit more interactive. I really like that format. So thanks for being willing to do that, Sabrina, and for a wonderful presentation, Renee. Just a reminder to everybody about our talks coming up. I really hope we'll get to see you again. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful evening. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Renee.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Nicole.